John Donne, evaluating the religious implications of science, once said, "Knowledge cannot save us, but we cannot be saved without knowledge. Faith is not on this side of knowledge, but beyond it." Much of Donne's poetry and prose owe their difficulty to the approach he takes towards the schism between scientia and sapientia. He has been charged with obscurity for employing esoteric and often disagreeable ideas in his poetry, running the whole gamut of scientific and philosophical data available to him. His versatility enabled him to react in a sensitive and intellectual way to both traditional learning and a new knowledge of his generation. In John Donne and the New Philosophy, Charles M. Coffin suggests that the increasing modern appreciation of Donne is due to the fact that there is in his poetry, quote, "something answering to the needs of the present mind," unquote. Such statements, more than suggesting Donne's modernity, point to the unchangeable and existential human impulse to find a way through vast tracts of available knowledge to faith, to atonement with God. Though he was greatly acquainted with science, he was no scientist. In his hands, it became an instrument to express with considerable maturity an impulse to inquire religious and poetic truths. In the first anniversary, the poet persona assumes the role of an anatomist, as the poem's subtitle suggests, and he is confronted with the inevitable contradiction that is inherent in the act of anatomizing. The anatomy is at the same time an attempt to reveal internal order and a process which causes further decay. It may be said that since Donne is concerned not so much with the world as with the absent figure of Elizabeth Drury, this obvious corollary of consequent decay can be overlooked. But such simplification is hardly possible when we consider that the poem is not about Elizabeth Drury, but actually what she stands for. In reply to Ben Jonson's remark that, quote, "if it had been written of the Virgin Mary, it had been something," unquote, Donne had retorted that the poem is about the idea of a woman, not as she was. Indeed, to write a poem about a woman whom the poet has never met, and in such hyperbolic tone as Donne does in this poem, invites us to read it as some sort of a satire. And though the satiric elements cannot be missed, the poem is also a very personal utterance about how the poet feels about the world around him and the world inside him. In Donne's Anniversaries and the Art of Living, Ruth A. Fox tells us, "To read the poems in praise of Elizabeth Drury is to be forced to forget Elizabeth Drury in order to remember Donne. At the outset, a contrast is built up between her heaven, which is entirely hers as it is God's, where her rich feminine soul goes, and this world which functions in terms of the microcosm-macrocosm analogy that informs the entire poem. Microcosm is the epitome of the world or the greater universe, and the two are related in continuous correspondence. In Holy Sonnet number 5, Donne refers to a common belief of his age when he presents man as a microcosm. Quote, "She to whom this world must itself refer, as suburbs are the microcosm of her," unquote. Having established this relationship between her and the world, Donne goes on to examine what might her death mean to the world and the perplexed doubt that results from it. The notion of doubt with its associations of felix culpa, the central paradox of Christianity, and the Baroque doubt are something which pervades the whole poem. For Donne, the Baroque conflict of ideas, of new and uncontrollable ideas that are extensive enough to invert the very foundations of the world. The doubt as to whether the world did lose or gain in this provides him with a cue for understanding the nature of world itself. The world is morbidly imaged as a dying man instead of a dead man. With Drury's death, it is left dry of the vital spirits which in Donne's time were regarded as substances of blood connecting the body and the soul. The stammered horror of she is dead, she is dead, echoes a line from the Dissolution. She is dead, and all which die to their first elements resolve. The image of emptiness is further emphasized by the absence of balm or physique. Quote, "Sick world, ye dead, ye putrefied, since she, intrinsic balm and thy preservative, can never be renewed." Donne's basic proposition is that Elizabeth Drury's death means the death of the world, and this he makes clear early in the poem. But there is more to it than what is apparent. The lady stands for the universal principle of life and concord, and essentially love, which is a source of harmony. Thus, harnessing the microcosm-macrocosm scheme, it would appear that her absence is also the upsurge of the forces of discord within the body itself. That Donne intended this harmony and its subsequent rupture to be seen in musical terms is evident in the line, quote, "She is now a part both of the choir and song," unquote, which anticipates the first stanza of Hymn to God in my sickness, a poem he wrote 8 days before he died. Quote, "Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints for evermore I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think now before." Unquote. The contempt for the world suggested by specific epithets like sick, dead, putrefied, corrupt, mortal is magnified by the ascendatic nervous energy of the poem. As the world approaches death, it is shown to be growing speechless and losing sense and memory. The lethargy it has fallen into is not merely a physical lethargy, but a senseless disease, a disease that takes the senses away from the soul. In one of his sermons, Donne talks about balsamum suum, which he characterizes as natural virtue, and by which any wound can cure itself. It is possible that he talks here of the same substance when he mentions vital spirits. So, if the vital spirits are irrevocably gone from the body, it implies a very impossibility of cure. Indeed, Donne stresses this point, quote, "There is no health. Physicians say that we at best enjoy but a neutrality," unquote. And this disease is so pervasive, it admits no cure. The impossibility of attaining health, of course, has its origins in the original sin. In this context, health bears moral and ethical connotations. It is a physical or physiological condition of the body, but it is also the state of the soul. Since we are born ruinous, Donne says, our life is governed by forces of mutability. He echoes Aquinas's belief that we nurture death by procreating. But more importantly, perhaps he refers to the popular and scientific commonplace that sexual intercourse shortens life when he says, quote, "We kill ourselves to propagate our kind," unquote. Again, brevity of life is something which is a result of Drury's death, and the way Donne puts it, there seems to be a large change in the ecological system of the world itself since her death. The timelessness of natural existence that prevailed prior to her death is suggested in a concentrated, elusive statement. Quote, "When, if a slow-paced star had stolen away from the observer's marking, he might stay 200 or 300 years to see it again and then make up his observation plane." Unquote. This is clearly a reference to the cyclical order that the spheres were believed to follow. Perhaps he also is pointing at the measurement of latitude and longitude of a star by determining its altitude with an astronomical instrument. The word observation is important because it probably suggests the increasing reliance on observational and experimental data, especially after the invention of the telescope. An extended reference to astrology and astronomy occurs between lines 251 and 284. The heavenly spheres affected by the dissonance follow a perplexed course, which is to say that their involuted, tangled movements confuse the observer. And though they are not mutually exclusive, they are swayed by the cosmic perplexity in the heavens. This irregularity, says Donne, enforces men to find out so many eccentric parts. The allusion here is to the eccentric circles of Ptolemaic astronomy, fashioned in such a way as to make necessary adjustments in confused data. The 8 and 40 lines steering the firmament refer to those as an astronomical map of heavens. Subsequently, this is shown to be influencing the zodiac. The ecliptic is a great circle of the celestial sphere that is the apparent path of the sun. The plane of the Earth's orbit extended to meet the celestial sphere. It is also, as we know it now, a great circle drawn on a terrestrial globe, making an angle of about 23 degrees 27 minutes with the equator, and used for illustrating and solving astronomical problems. Donne refers to the variations in the obliquity of the ecliptic. He says of the sun, quote, "For his course is not round, nor can the sun perfect a circle, or maintain his way 1 inch direct, but where he rose today, he comes no more but with a cozening line." Unquote. This was one of the great astronomical problems of the age. Since the obliquity of the ecliptic steadily decreased throughout the ages, people were afraid that the declination would eventually disappear. But it is also possible to think that Donne is talking about the constant shifts in the obliquity instead of its declination, suggesting that the sun cannot perfect a circle, drawing his inference from the precession of the equinoxes. Astronomical phenomena are brought to illustrate a moral truth, and the imperfection that is attributed to them are essentially human. Quote, "He comes no more but with a cozening line, steals by that point, and so is serpentine. And seeming weary with his reeling thus, he means to sleep, being now fallen nearer us. So of the stars which boast that they do run in circles still, none ends where he begun." When Donne says all their proportions lame, it sinks, it swells, he evokes an image of a cripple, alternately rising and falling, with one leg shorter than the other. Subsequently, we find the striking image of the stars has reined wild horses, and it is really a jibe at the astronomers of his time, whose conceit made them think that they know everything about the universe and can even control it. Quote, "We spur, we rein the stars, and in their race they're diversely content to obey our pace." Unquote. So all these disturbances and irregularities in the universe are seen as consequences of Drury's death. The Copernican revolution had a permanent influence on how people thought about the universe, and though Donne, who according to W. Milgate was the Copernicus of poetry, refers to scientific phenomena, he does not take sides. He does not say whether he supports geocentricity or heliocentricity. He simply uses these theories to illustrate figuratively his primary point, which is the death of Elizabeth Drury and how it affected the anatomy of the world. The world is affected both temporally and spatially, and the general flaccidity is a consequence of her death. Quote, "And as in lasting, so in length is man contracted to an inch who was a span." Unquote. Donne envisions the stupendous mechanism of the universe by implication through the image of a clock. He condemns men who spend their time studying clocks instead of focusing their gaze at the new-made firmament and the truth it contains. His contempt is reiterated in lines such as, quote, "Old grandsires talk of yesterday with sorrow." Unquote. The atrophy pervades both the intellectual and the physical. Quote, "With new diseases on ourselves we wore, and with new physique a worse engine far." Unquote. Where new diseases here referred to specifically to syphilis, which had spread across Europe in the 15th century. New physique is obviously the new breed of physicians led by Paracelsus. Several implications are to be found in what Donne means by disease. In his anatomical query, disease in the body is immediately related to the disturbances in the state in the form of the civil war and the disturbances in the universe. The idea of man as a musical instrument in the hands of God is consonant with the internal physiological balance of harmony. A distempered body is like a nation in a state of internal feuds. "The heart being perished, no part can be free," says Donne, and we can almost perceive the sense of anarchy that such a perishment would engender, either in a society or in the body. The strong alchemical imagery of the compassionate turquoise suggests the futility of new physique, because the very absence of the stone points at the impossibility of the prognostication of the disease. This image leads on to the next, which is perhaps more identifiable. Quote, "As gold falls sick being stung with mercury, all the world's part of such complexion be." Unquote. Mercury is the integral part of alchemy, and its union with sulfur to produce mercuric sulfide is perceived as almost a sexual consummation in alchemical parlance. The picture of the world that Donne evokes here is one bereft of its coherence, proportion, symmetry, color, Each joint of the universal frame is dissolved in the steady, relentless process of decay. The poet is confronted with an indescribable nothingness, and his imagery exposes a dual sense of fascination and horror. It is, as John Carey puts it, a black hole into which everything intelligible slid. History is seen to be following a trajectory of downward spiral, a descent into darkness. The allegorical method, as Donne is using it, is characterized by the replacement of historical facts with a constant awareness of the decline of history. Donne is constantly intrigued by the possibility of God's idleness. If he ceased to exercise his sustaining power, there would be nothing to stop this downward spiral into the horror of being forgotten by God. Elsewhere he says, "Be angry with me, God. God, be angry with me," and insists on being either punished for his sins or forgiven but never abandoned by him. When we are faced with the perplexed doubt of spiral nothingness, the only human response is, in Walter Benjamin's phrase, faithless leap into faith. And this act initiates a rearrangement, a relocation of human fate into the divinely ordained scheme of the universe. The moment which Donne captures in the first anniversary is a moment of collapse and loss, but there is always an implicit presence of a plea to God to display his power. Grace is not something which human beings deserve, but it is a spectacular, miraculous display of God's power. And this power is essentially love, which binds the order of things and renders the universe coherent and meaningful. So the act of anatomizing can be interpreted as Donne's desire to be a part of that power. The most direct, if not exactly detailed reference to the philosophical scientific debates of his age occur in these lines, quote, "A new philosophy calls all in doubt, the element of fire is quite put out, the sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it," unquote. The sun, like the image of Christ on cross in the poem Good Friday 1613 riding westward, comes to signify the fixed, stable center of the universe, integral to cosmic and mundane harmony. The simple monosyllables of these lines expose the danger of destabilization and dislocation. Donne's perplexed doubt is not exactly Tennyson's honest doubt. It is a more complex, contingent, often skeptical and essentially philosophical contemplation involving inbuilt paradoxes. But the doubt is at the same time personal and social, leading to general confusions consequent upon scientific debates. It is not easy to ascertain whether Donne was fearing a paradigm shift, to use Thomas Kuhn's famous phrase, but to say that he was referring to the Paracelsian attack upon Aristotelianism would perhaps not be irrelevant. The act of putting out the element of fire would then imply the upsurge of the atomists and the new philosophy in general. Lucretius, with whose De Rerum Natura was atomic theory primarily associated, did not actually refute Empedocles' quaternary system, but his theory posits that each of the elements must in turn be composed of atoms. It is important to ascertain a precise definition of atom. It is an irreducible, indestructible material unity. The other definitions of atom are, however, more pertinent to the first anniversary. An anatomical preparation, especially a skeleton. Donne's search then is directed at finding something incorruptible, something indivisible and proportionate in a crumbling mass, not unlike the heap of broken images in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. This search can directly be equated with quest for divine love at the level of macrocosm. There is an obvious correspondence between the material remains and the spiritual residue of cosmological harmony. The purpose of anatomy is to find out, therefore, what we human beings lack, and Donne's examination leads him to the realization that there is always something that remains. Quote, "Let no man say, the world itself being dead, 'tis labor lost to have discovered the world's infirmities, since there is none alive to study this dissection, for there is a kind of world remaining still." In material terms, Donne's poetry abounds with ideas and images which emphasize recurrently the obvious corollary of the atomist motto, "Nothing comes out of nothing." The subtle wreath of hair, or the bracelet of bright hair about the bone, bear physical testimony to this fact. Upon Mr. Coryat's treatise, a satiric analysis of Coryat's corpus, Donne writes, quote, "The bravest heroes, for public good, scattered in diverse lands their limbs and blood, Worst malefactors to whom men are prize do public good cut in anatomies. Donne's Anatomy likewise will do public good to the extent that, quote, "Thou knowest how wan a ghost this our world is, and learnest thus much by our anatomy," unquote. It will also function to discover and reveal the pattern of goodness embodied within the departed lady, and by association will plead God to show his power, that is love. To return to the condition of the world that Donne finds it in while anatomizing the barren infertile nature is powerfully conveyed through the image of the barren earth waiting hopelessly for rain. The idea of the union between water and earth and subsequent fecundity is linked to the symbolic alchemical unions between mercury and sulfur, lion and eagle. There is an image of incubation here, quote, "The air doth not motherly sit on the earth to hatch her seasons and give all things birth," unquote. The possible reference here is also to the union between Uranus and Gaia. Milton's image of God bringing something out of nothing, of course, conforms absolutely to Genesis and runs counter to the materialist anatomistic theory. The world is more than in one way false. Donne talks about the false conceptions that fill the general wombs, and later implies that though the lady gave the world the appearance of gold, she did not turn it into actual gold. Hence, Donne speaks here as a renegade Catholic and alludes to transubstantiation in an ironic way. Since the world is reduced to crumbling masses of atomies, it has turned monochromatic and ashen. The atoms unable to retain the elemental properties of matter cannot be identified singularly, but is quite capable of reintegration. The fact that something is always retained is hinted in the following lines, quote, "Herbs and roots by dying lose not all, but they ye ashes too are medicinal," unquote. The contrast between the lady's perfection and the world's imperfection is evident throughout the poem, and this provides a kind of linchpin around which Donne's anatomizing turns. This dichotomy is also something which cannot wholly be reconciled. In one sense, the world's imperfection accounts for her death, but some of the benefits she had bestowed upon the earth perhaps still persist. Donne's preoccupation with what remains and his contemplation on bodily and spiritual regeneration makes him think about the science of anatomy itself. Metaphorically, if he would chop the body into tiny pieces, he would not be able to help them from decaying. In another sense, the very act of writing poetry is anatomizing. Elegies are what the living write about the dead. They are songs of mourning, but the way Donne writes the anniversaries, it seems they are a part of a celebration. Celebration of the power of poetry itself. Poets are superior to historians because their songs will remain in the heart of men. A thought to Donne, says Eliot, was an experience, and it transformed his vision. Donne's anatomy involves life and motion expressed both outward and inward, exploration of new lands, discovery of natural facts, expansion of thought and learning, and the place he reserves for poetry in the cycles of order and disorder. He says, quote, "Verse hath a middle nature, heaven keeps souls, the grave keeps bodies, verse the fame enrolls," unquote.